There are things a town decides before it has any evidence, and one of those things, in the late September of 1887, was that Nora Voss had made the worst purchase in the recorded history of Harlan County. She had paid $300, every cent she had, for 50 acres of river-bottom land so thoroughly strangled by common buckthorn that you could not push a walking stick into it without the thorns drawing blood. The land sat at the low end of Cutler's Bend, where the Maris River made its slow southward turn, and it had been surrendered by the estate of a man named Aldous Crew, who had tried to farm it for 11 years and produced nothing but a catalogue of grievances and an early grave. The county auctioneer, a cheerful man named Dolph Stiers, announced the parcel with the careful neutrality of a man describing a house fire. And when Nora raised her bidding card in the third row of the courthouse steps, 4 people laughed out loud, and 2 more looked away in second-hand embarrassment. She was 21 years old. She had come into Harlan County 8 months earlier with a wagon, a mule, $40, and the particular kind of silence that some people mistake for slowness. She had worked through the winter as a hired hand on the Gantner place, sleeping in the tack room and saving what little the work paid her, and she had spent every Sunday morning that the road was clear walking the fence lines of every parcel she could reach. She was not walking for pleasure. She was looking for something. What she found in the end was the Crew land. Now, $300 was a sum that could have bought Nora a small house in town with a sound roof and a stove that drew properly. It could have bought the clean northeast quarter of the Aldrich farm, which old Frank Aldrich was selling to settle his son's debts, a quarter section with good loam and a working well. Any sensible person, 3 or 4 of them told her directly, would have made either of those choices. She stood in the thin fall light and heard them out with an expression that could not be called polite agreement, but was careful not to be rude, and then she bought the Buckthorn acres. Dolph Stiers handed her the deed with the faint solemnity of a man administering last rites. 8 months earlier, 8 months before the auction, Nora had been standing at the edge of that same land in the very first warmth of February, watching a small herd of dairy goats that belonged to a Bohemian farmer named André Horak work their deliberate way through a thicket of buckthorn scrub with the focused satisfaction of creatures performing a sacred duty. They ate the bark, they ate the twigs, they stripped the leaves with a sideways pull of the jaw and reached back for more before they had finished swallowing. Buckthorn, which would dishearten a horse and defeat a hog and cause a beef cow to turn away in contempt, was to a goat approximately equivalent to a Sunday dinner. She stood there for a long time. André Horak came to collect his animals at sundown and found her still watching. He was a man of perhaps 65, built low and square as a root cellar, with white hair and a face that had been simplified by decades of weather into a few essential lines. He looked at what she was watching and then looked at her. "The land does not know it is worthless," he said. He had an accent that rounded his vowels and gave his consonants a careful weight. "Only the people know." She asked if he would sell her 6 does and a buck. He said he would think on it. She waited, which was a thing she was very good at. He sold her 7 does and a buck 8 days later for $32, which was a fair price, and he threw in, at no charge, 2 years of information about goats and fencing and what buckthorn would and would not do to a piece of ground once the animals had worked it for a full season. He told her about the old ice house that sat somewhere in the middle of the Crew land, built back in the 1860s by a man who had quarried blocks from the river in winter and sold them as far south as Gantner's Crossing. And he told her the walls of that structure were fieldstone and lime, 2 feet thick, and that if the roof still held, she had better housing than most people in the county. She stored all of this in the careful interior where she kept everything that mattered. By the 3rd week of October, Nora Voss had her 50 acres, her 8 goats, a roll of woven wire she had bought on credit from the Harlan Hardware, and $112 remaining to her name. She had no house yet on the land. She drove out each morning from a rented room above the dry goods and drove back each evening with her hands bleeding from buckthorn cuts, and she built her fence. The arithmetic was not comfortable. She ran it in the dark of that rented room every night the way a person runs their tongue over a loose tooth, not because she expected a different answer, but because she needed to know exactly where she stood. Feed for the winter if the brush ran low. Medicine for the animals if they fell sick. Wire if the fence failed. The number at the bottom of every column was small, and it did not grow. She crossed nothing out. She added nothing false. What it told her was that she had one bad stroke of luck to spend before everything unraveled, and she could not afford to spend it. She went to work. A goat, it should be said, is a creature that looks perpetually mildly startled and permanently opinionated, as though it has just received news that is both unexpected and exactly what it expected. Nora's 8 arrived at the Crew land and regarded the shoulder-high wall of buckthorn along the south fence line with an expression that could only be described as professionally interested. She opened the gate and they went in at a businesslike walk, and by the end of the first week they had cleared a corridor 12 feet wide and 60 feet long. She had not fed them a single fork of hay. She found the ice house on the 14th day. It sat in the center of the property on a slight rise, which was why it was still standing, she understood, since everything lower had spent the better part of 3 decades being seasonally flooded. And its roof was cedar shingle, gray with age but sound along the whole of the north slope, and compromised only in a 6-foot section above the southeast corner, where a century-old elm had dropped a branch through it sometime in recent years. The walls were exactly as André Horak had described them. She stood inside and felt the cold that had lived in those stones since the 1860s, and thought it was the finest room she had ever been in. She patched the roof with cedar planks split from a downed tree on the east edge of the property, worked the line between 2 courses of stone that had crept apart over the decades, swept the dirt floor until it was as smooth as packed clay could be, and moved herself out of the rented room above the dry goods on the 17th of November, 4 days before the first hard freeze. André Horak came to see it in early December, driving his small wagon with a load of split firewood. He said he had extra of, which was a polite lie that she accepted graciously. He stood in the doorway of the ice house and looked at the light she had made of it, the small cast-iron stove she had bought second-hand, the shelf she had built above it, the lantern, the packed earth floor with a braided rug she had made from rags, the stall she had partitioned along the north wall for the goats' overnight shelter. He looked for a long time. "You see what is there," he said. "Most people only see what is not there." It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it, and Harlan County's relationship with Nora Voss in that first winter operated on exactly that principle. The town agreed, without having to discuss it, that she would be gone by spring. 2 or 3 of the men at the hardware counter said so directly. A woman named Edna Pryor, who ran the Harlan County Ledger's social column and considered herself a barometer of local common sense, wrote 4 lines noting that the young woman who had acquired the Crew land was believed by most to be overmatched, and that the county wished her the ordinary mercies. Nora did not read the Ledger's social column. She was busy counting. By the end of February, the 8 goats had cleared roughly 4 acres of brush, and the ground they had worked was naked and black and beginning, in the warming days, to show a faint green fringe of grass at the margins where the light was finally reaching soil that had not seen the sun in decades. She crouched at the edge of it one morning and put her hand flat on the ground and felt the cold of it against her palm, and noted, in the careful ledger she kept in her head, that the soil was deep and dark and smelled of the river, good alluvial earth that the Maris had been laying down for 1,000 years, waiting under the brush, patient as buried treasure. She went to André Horak with a question. Was there anyone selling goats within 2 days' drive? He told her about 3 farms. She visited all 3 over the course of a week, driving the Gantner family's spare rig, which Mrs. Gantner lent her with the wordless generosity of a woman who had decided Nora was worth the gamble. At each farm she looked at the animals and the conditions and asked questions with the careful specificity of someone who has already done the arithmetic and knows exactly what she can afford to be wrong about. She bought 14 more does. She borrowed against the land to do it a $50 note from the Harlan savings that the loan officer named Caldwell Bryce gave her with the expression of a man certain he would never see the money again. She paid 5% interest per annum, which was the standard rate. The note came due in 18 months. She wrote the date on the inside cover of the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, where she could find it in the dark without looking. By June, Nora Voss had 22 goats on the property. She had also, in the weeks between the winter's end and the first true warmth, done something the town did not yet know about. She had taken 12 of the cleared acres, the flattest and most southerly, where the goats had worked longest, and where she had spent the late winter hauling the stripped buckthorn brush into windrows and burning it in slow, smoky fires that sent columns of gray up into the February sky. She had taken those 12 acres, and with a borrowed iron-wheeled plow and her 1 mule working in long straight passes, broken them open. She had put in oats on 9 acres, and on the remaining 3 she had planted something that caused the seed merchant in town, a deliberate man named Abner Wills, to look up from his counter with new attention when she told him what she wanted. "Chicory," she said. He looked at her. "Feed crop?" "Some, and the other use." He said nothing for a moment. Then he weighed out the seed. The chicory was a piece of reasoning she had worked through the previous fall and had not shared with anyone except, obliquely, André Horak, who had looked at the ground she was indicating and nodded slowly in the way of a man who sees the sense but would not have thought of it himself. Chicory rooted deep, deeper than most weeds, and it broke the hard clay pan that centuries of flooding had compacted below the top soil, and as a forage it was more than the goats could eat at a seeding, which meant the surplus could be harvested and dried and sold as a coffee substitute or a coffee adulterant, which was not the most elegant commerce in the world, but was commerce, and commerce was what she needed. More than that, the chicory flower was a pale blue that came in August, and she had read in an old agricultural pamphlet she had found in the ice house that must have belonged to Aldous Crew in one of his more optimistic periods, that bees worked chicory heavily, and that an apiarist within 2 miles of a good chicory stand would see his yield improve by 1/3. She did not yet have bees. But she had noted the information and set it aside in the place where she kept things that were not yet useful, but would be. She also had, by early summer, a 9th goat that had not been bought. He had arrived in April on his own, having apparently walked several miles from the Truesdale farm to the north, through a gap in a fence that old Chet Truesdale had been meaning to mend since the previous autumn. He was a large gray buck with 1 torn ear and an expression of settled certainty that Nora found she respected. She returned him twice. He came back twice. On the 3rd return, Chet Truesdale, who was 78 and not entirely well, told her to keep him. He had more bucks than sense in keeping. His name, according to the 9-year-old daughter of the neighboring family who came by with her mother to look at the goats one afternoon, was obviously Gerald. Nora accepted this. The child, whose name was Bess Forder, came back twice more that week, and by the end of June had appointed herself the informal superintendent of all naming operations on the property. The original 8 goats had been anonymous for months. By July 4th they had names. Nora could not bring herself to discourage it. There was something in the way Bess moved among the animals, fearless, chattering, completely certain of her authority, that reminded Nora, in a way she did not examine closely, of something she wanted the land to become. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The Maris River dropped 3 inches in the first 2 weeks, and the creeks above the bend went to a trickle, and then to a line of damp sand, and then to nothing. The wheat on the high ground farms came in thin and scorched, and what it came into was a market already depressed by the bumper harvests of the 2 years prior. The corn burned in the field on the Aldrich quarter, the good loam quarter that Nora had not bought. Old Frank Aldrich, who had sold the clean northeast parcel to a young man from Illinois named Tremont, stood on his reduced land and watched the Illinois man's corn go gray and then brown and then nothing. And Harlan County understood by the middle of August that it was in a dry year that would not recover. Nora's 9 cleared acres of oats were not fine. She had lost perhaps a quarter of the stand to the heat and the shallow-rooted vulnerability of grain under drought. But the goats did not eat oats, and the goats had water, because the one thing the Crew land had that the high-ground farms did not was the old ice house pond, a spring-fed basin quarried out in the 1860s to supply the building operation, 15 feet at its deepest, fed by a limestone seep that ran independent of the river and independent of the rain. In the worst week of August, when the Maurice dropped to a series of disconnected muddy pools and people were hauling water in barrels from the artesian well in town, Nora's pond stood within 8 inches of its normal summer level. She knew what this meant. She ran the arithmetic, and it told her something large. She said nothing. She banked it like a coal under ash and let it wait. The man who came to see her in the 3rd week of August was named Porter Gill. He was the regional representative of a livestock buying concern out of Kansas City, and he was known in the county as a man who arrived when things were low and left when they were lower. He drove a good buggy and wore a good suit, and had the particular kind of good manners that are, in fact, a tool rather than a disposition. He had heard, from sources he did not name, that the Voss woman out at Cutler's Bend had animals that were healthy and had water. He sat on the mounting block outside the ice house with his hat in his hands and told her that he had buyers who were in urgent need of good stock, that the price being paid in Kansas City for healthy does was strong, and that, given her circumstances, a young woman alone, carrying debt, on land that most people considered difficult, he felt he could offer her a fair consolidating price for her whole herd. He named a figure. It was just below what she had paid for the animals. Nora looked at him for a moment. The quality of her looking, by this point in her life, was something people tended to remember. It was not hostile. It was the kind of attention you feel when someone is reading something written in small print. She said that she was not selling. He said that was a brave position for a person alone on questionable land, with a note coming due. She said that she had 16 months on the note, and that her arithmetic did not suggest she needed his help. He said he admired her confidence. He said the word the way people sometimes say a word when they mean the opposite of it. He put his hat back on and drove away, and she watched the dust his wheels raised, and felt something in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but was related to both. What she did not know yet, though she would know it soon enough, was that Porter Gill had been making the same visit across the county for 2 weeks, and that in 6 of those visits the answer had been yes, and that the animals purchased at distressed prices would be resold at full market price, and that the difference between those 2 numbers was where Porter Gill lived. She also did not know, and this would matter more, that Caldwell Bryce at the Harlan Savings had mentioned to Porter Gill that the note on the Voss property was coming due in 14 months, which was information Bryce had no business sharing with a livestock buyer, and which was a thing Nora would eventually learn and recognize for what it was. But that was later. What happened first was September. The chicory bloomed through the drought as if it had agreed privately to prove a point. 3 acres of pale blue running along the southern edge of the cleared ground, staked and alive, while the surrounding countryside went the color of old paper. André Horak came to look at it on a Sunday and stood in the rows for several minutes in silence. Then he said something in Bohemian that Nora did not understand, and then he said, in English, "My wife's father grew this in Moravia. He sold it to the coffee merchants in Brno. They came to him, he did not go to them." She harvested the chicory roots in late September, after the first frost had sweetened them slightly, working in the early morning before the ground hardened, pulling the long taproots by hand and laying them in rows on boards she had set across the wagon bed. She split and dried them in the ice house, where the airflow through the stone walls kept a steady temperature, and when the roots were fully dry, she loaded them into burlap sacks she had bought for the purpose and drove them to town. The person she went to see was not the general merchant. She went to the Harlan Hotel and asked to speak with the cook. The cook was a man named Lars Sundelius, who had come out from Minneapolis 4 years earlier and who served at the Harlan Hotel's dining room, the closest approximation to a proper restaurant that existed in the county. He was a large, unhurried man with an opinion about everything edible, and he tasted the dried chicory Nora put before him the way a judge handles evidence, seriously and without rushing. He asked where it had come from. She said her land. He asked how much she had. She told him. He looked at the amount for a long moment, doing what she recognized as arithmetic. He offered her a price 30% above what the general merchant paid for dried chicory as a coffee additive. She accepted without bargaining, because it was a fair price, and because Lars Sundelius would tell people where it had come from, and Lars Sundelius talking to hotel guests was worth more than the 30%. This is how Harlan County began to learn in the fall of 1888 that something was happening out at Cutler's Bend. It did not learn it all at once. It learned it the way a town learns most things, in pieces through conversation, half of it right and half of it elaborated, and all of it arriving at the general store on the lips of someone who had heard it from someone who had been there. Lars Sundelius told a cattle buyer from St. Joseph that the chicory in his coffee came from a young woman who had cleared 50 acres of thorns with goats. The cattle buyer told someone. Edna Pryor of the Ledger social column heard a version of it and revised her assessment, and the revision was published without any reference to her previous assessment, which is another ordinary mercy. What the town could see by October of 1888 was more direct. The Maris River had recovered with the fall rains, and the county was counting its drought losses, and the accounting was grim. 3 farms in foreclosure on the high ground. The Illinois man Tremont had taken his burned corn and gone back to Illinois. The high-ground wheat growers who had sold their reserves in the spring at low prices had nothing to sell in the fall and nothing to cover against the bank. And at Cutler's Bend, if you drove past on the Maris Road, you could see through the cleared line of the fence a piece of country that looked improbably like a farm. The buckthorn was not gone. There were still 20 acres of it along the north and west edges, but the south and east of the property had been transformed into something functional and alive. The goats moved through it in groups, steady and purposeful. The chicory ground had been cleared and turned for spring. The oat field, thin as it had come in, had been harvested and the straw stacked. The ice house, with its new patched roof and its single window glass that Nora had installed in July, showed a light in the evening. Bess Forder, who came most Saturdays now with or without her mother, told anyone who would listen at the Harlan school that there were 26 goats and that their names were Gerald, Matilda, Agnes, Persephone, Ruth, Cornelia, and so on through 26. Her teacher, a tired woman named Miss Hale, confirmed this to her own satisfaction on a Saturday afternoon visit that began as pastoral curiosity and ended with Lars Sundelius's assessment. Here was something worth watching. Porter Gill came back in November. He came with a different approach and a third person, a man he introduced as a land assessor, which he was, but which he was also doing on behalf of the Harlan Savings, where Caldwell Bryce had, it emerged, been discussing the Voss note with rather more people than was appropriate. The assessor moved around the property with a clipboard and a self-important manner, calling numbers into a small book, and Nora watched him do it from the door of the ice house without moving. Porter Gill came to stand near her and said, with the careful warmth of a man trying a second approach, that he had a proposal. He said that given the value the land had generated, and he said value in the way that meant he had been paying attention for the past year and was now recalculating, he had a buyer interested in the whole of the property. He named a number that was, she noticed, 3 times what she had paid at auction. It was designed to impress. It was, in fact, a compliment in arithmetic, though it was not intended as one. She asked who the buyer was. He said that was not information he was positioned to share. She asked how he had known specifically how many acres she had cleared in the past 6 weeks, a figure she had not shared with anyone, and which the assessor's clipboard had, some 40 minutes ago, produced. Gill said nothing for a moment. The quality of the pause was informative. She said that she was not selling. She said it the same way she had said it in August, without emphasis, as though she were confirming that the sky was still above and the ground still below. She said that the note with Harlan Savings would be settled in full in 3 months, on the date written in her notebook, and that if Caldwell Bryce had further professional curiosity about her finances, she invited him to ask her directly. Gill looked at her for a moment. He looked at the ice house, the pond behind it catching the November light, the cleared acres going to winter dormancy in long, dark rows. He looked at the goats in the near field, ridiculous and magnificent, grazing the last green shoots. He left without saying goodbye to the assessor, which was, in the way of such men, something close to the truth about him expressed in a single action. Caldwell Bryce was replaced as loan officer at the Harlan Savings in the following February, for reasons that the new president of the Savings, a man named Arthur Veit, described publicly as related to professional discretion. The community understood what this meant. It was the kind of event that a town notes and then discusses in quiet satisfaction for several years. The note was settled in full on the 17th of March, 1889, 18 months and 3 weeks after Nora had signed it, and 2 months ahead of the due date. She drove into Harlan with a bank draft and put it on Veit's desk herself, and Veit stood up to shake her hand, which was not a thing he did for most of his borrowers. The spring that followed was the one people in Harlan County would eventually call, in the shorthand of shared memory, just Nora's spring, though they did not call it that yet, because naming a thing takes time, and the spring was still happening. The chicory had reseeded itself across the 3 original acres and was moving into a 4th, and she let it move. She had planted the 9 oat acres again, this time with a bushel to the acre more seed and a compost of goat manure and straw that she had been building all winter against the south side of the ice house, and the stand that came up in April was dense and dark green, and the kind of thing that made farmers slow their wagons on the road and look. She had also, in February, bought a hive from a beekeeper named Tatum, who was too old to work his full yard. Then she had bought 2 more. She set them at the south end of the chicory ground, close to the water, in a spot where the ice house pond threw afternoon light along the ground in a long, warm strip, and the bees emerged into the first warm days of late March, as though the arrangement had been their own idea. André Horak died in April of that year. He died in the way of men who have completed something, in his bed, without surprise or struggle. And Nora heard about it from Mrs. Forder, who had heard it from a neighbor, and she sat very still in the ice house for a while, with her hands around a cup of coffee that had chicory in it. She thought about the February morning she had stood at the edge of the Buckthorn and watched his goats work. She thought about his vowels and his patience, and the way he had looked at the ice house when it was finished. She thought about the word he had said in the field that day, the one she didn't understand. She asked Mrs. Forder later if she knew what the Bohemian word for abundance was. Mrs. Forder did not know. But she asked around, and the word came back to Nora 2 weeks later on a slip of paper, written in Mrs. Forder's hand, Hojnost. Nora wrote it in the inside cover of her small notebook, below the date of the settled note. By June of 1889, Nora Voss had 31 goats, 4 acres of chicory, a healthy oat stand, 3 beehives in active production, and 20 acres of buckthorn left to clear. She had a buyer for the chicory in Lars Sundelius, who had told the hotel management in Gantner's Crossing about it, and the Gantner's Crossing Hotel had sent a letter. She had a buyer for surplus does in a dairy operation that had started up near the county seat and needed good breeding stock. She had, quietly and without announcement, moved from the arithmetic of survival to the arithmetic of something else. She did not have a word for the new arithmetic yet. She was still getting used to it. The summer brought a visitor she had not expected, the young man Tremont, the Illinois man who had burned his corn and gone home, came back through the county in July, passing through on his way to somewhere else, and stopped at the Maris Road to look through the fence at what the Crew land had become. He stood there long enough that Bess Forder, who was sitting on the fence post eating an early apple, offered him a look at the goats if he wanted. He wanted. He walked the cleared ground with an expression Nora recognized as the one she had worn in February of 1887, standing at the edge of the buckthorn, watching Horrocks' animals work. The expression of a person doing arithmetic on something they have not yet decided to hope for. She gave him a cup of coffee with chicory, and he drank it and said it was good. She told him what was in it and where it came from. He looked at the pale blue acres of it in the afternoon light. He asked if she had thought about selling the excess seed. She had not, because she had not had excess seed yet, but she saw at once that she would. She said she would be in contact. Tremont left with a handshake and an address written in her notebook, and Nora walked back to the ice house through the field with the bees working the chicory around her, the goats steady in the south pasture, the oats full in the flat acres, the pond winking at the far end of the property in the late afternoon light. She went inside and sat on the stool by the small window and opened the notebook. She looked at the inside cover, the settled note date, the word in Mrs. Forder's hand. Then she added Tremont's address below it. Then she closed the book. It was late in the summer of 1890 when the last of the buckthorn acres fell to the goats. It happened not in a single dramatic clearing, but in the incremental way that most important things happen, field by field and week by week, until one morning in September, Nora walked the full fence line and found that there was no solid wall of thorns remaining anywhere on the property, only scattered remnant canes in the corners and along the low north bank, which the goats were working with their habitual satisfaction. She stood at the north fence and looked south across the whole 50 acres and saw her land. The word the town had settled on over the course of 3 years had shifted so gradually that most of them did not notice it shifting. The land they had called worthless, they now called productive. The woman they had called overmatched, they now called capable, which was perhaps the most Harlan County could bring itself to say directly, but which was, from a town like that, a considerable distance from where it had started. It was Edna Pryor who came closest, in the Ledger's Harvest edition, to saying the real thing. She wrote a short notice about the Cutler's Bend farm and its chicory and dairy operation, and noted that the Voss acres, which had been offered at auction 3 years prior without a single competitive bid, were now considered among the more productive 50 acres in the river bottom, and that they had been made so by methods most of the county had not previously considered. She did not mention what she had written in 1887. A town has its dignities. Nora read that notice and put the paper down and went out to work. That fall the drought returned, not so severe as the summer of 1888, but enough to dry the creek beds above the bend and stress the high-ground crops and remind the county what it had been through 2 years before. Families on the marginal farms ate carefully and watched the sky with a particular expression of people who have been disappointed by the sky before and have not entirely forgiven it. On the last Friday of September, Nora loaded the wagon with 25 pounds of dried chicory root, 6 quarts of honey in sealed jars, and 4 bushels of oats, and she drove into Harlan and unloaded them on the steps of the Methodist Church Hall, which was where the town gathered in hard seasons to see what could be shared. She set no prices. She told Reverend Marsh what each thing was worth at market, so that the accounts could be kept fair, and she told him she would be back the following Friday with more. She was back the following Friday, and the one after. The winter passed in the way that hard winters pass when a community is watching out for itself, rather than only for the parts of itself that are doing well, not without difficulty, but with enough. In February, as she had done every February since 1887, Nora walked the fence lines of her land at first light, to read what the season had done to the ground, and what the ground intended to do with the spring. It was not a thing she could have explained fully to someone who had not spent 3 years learning the particular language of those 50 acres, the way the seep spring announced a wet winter in its flow rate, the way the goats' behavior in the south pasture indicated what was happening below the surface, the way the chicory came up in the first warm days as a bulletin about the soil's condition. She had learned to listen to what others did not bother to hear, and the land had learned, in the slow way land learns things, which is through what is planted and tended and given back, to answer. Bess Forder was 12 now, and came to the farm on Saturdays with a seriousness of purpose that had graduated from naming goats to helping with the hive inspections, a job she performed with the careful precision of a person who understands that the work is not about her. She had decided, she told Nora one afternoon in the honey house, which was what they called the section of the ice house where the extraction equipment lived, that she wanted to farm. Nora looked at her for a moment with the particular kind of attention she used when something required her full consideration. She said, "What kind?" Bess said she didn't know yet. Nora said, "Good, that means you're still looking." Andre Horak had been dead nearly 3 years, and she thought about him most mornings, in the way you think about people who told you true things, which is not as grief exactly, but as a continuing conversation. She thought about him when the bees were good and when the chicory was thick and when the goats moved through the last of a thicket with their professional satisfaction. And she thought about him on the February morning in 1891 when she crouched in the south pasture and put her hand flat on the ground and felt the warmth of it, the deep warmth of soil that has been worked and returned to and worked again, and understood that the land she had her hand on was not the same land that had been sold from underneath Aldous Crew. It was 50 acres, and it was hers, and it was alive. She stood up. Gerald, the gray buck with the torn ear, was watching her from 20 feet away, with his expression of settled certainty. She looked back at him. "I know," she said. She went to work. There are things a town decides before it has evidence, and then there are things a town is shown. And the distance between those two things is where most of the stories worth telling live. Nora Voss was 25 years old in the spring of 1891, and she owned 50 clear acres of the best river bottom soil in Harlan County, a spring-fed pond that had outlasted 2 droughts, 37 goats, whose names she knew by sound as well as sight, 4 beehives in heavy production, and an ice house with a new roof and a glass window that caught the morning light and threw it every clear day in a long gold bar across the packed earth floor. The land did not know it had been worthless. Andre Horak had told her that in the first winter, and she had stored it in the careful place where she kept the things that mattered, and she had found it there every time she needed it, which was most mornings in the early dark before the work began, in those first minutes when the arithmetic was still running, and the answer was small, and the ground outside was frozen, and the distance between where she was and where she needed to be felt very large. It was not the land that had been wrong about its own worth. It had known what it was the whole time. It had simply been waiting for someone to come and read it properly, in the way it needed to be read, not from the road, not from the courthouse steps, not from the distance at which a thing looks like a lost cause, but up close with both hands in it, before the light came up, patient, as the limestone seep in the floor of the icehouse pond, steady as water, finding its level, as certain as the chicory that knew how to root down through the hardpan and bring something hidden up into the light.